The Texas sun blazed high in the afternoon sky, casting long, shimmering waves of heat onto the pavement of downtown Houston. The air was thick with the scent of asphalt and distant car exhaust, the kind of sweltering summer day that made people quicken their steps just to find relief in an air-conditioned building. Amid the crowd of businesspeople, tourists, and street vendors, a small boy stood alone on the corner of Main and McKinney. Michael, just 6 years old, clutched a tattered wicker basket filled with neatly wrapped candy bars. His sneakers, worn so thin they barely held together, did little to shield his small feet from the heat radiating off the concrete. His oversized t-shirt hung loosely on his thin frame, a stark contrast to the well-dressed professionals who hurried past him without a second glance. With quiet determination, Michael scanned the bustling streets, waiting for the right moment to step forward. "Candy, ma'am?" he asked softly, approaching a woman in a crisp navy suit and high heels that clicked sharply against the sidewalk. She barely glanced at him, gripping her purse tighter as if his small presence posed a threat. Without a word, she brushed past him, her expensive perfume lingering in the hot, heavy air. Michael didn't flinch. He had gotten used to rejection. With a deep breath, he turned to another passerby, a man in a gray suit, his phone pressed firmly to his ear. "Just $1, sir." Michael held up a neatly wrapped peppermint, his dark brown eyes wide with hope. The man waved him off without breaking stride, too caught up in his conversation to notice the hunger etched into the little boy's face. As the sun inched lower in the sky, Michael felt the weight of the basket grow heavier in his small hands. His stomach rumbled, but he ignored it. Every dollar he made wasn't for him, it was for his mother's medicine. That thought alone gave him strength. From a distance, a group of children played frisbee in the park, their laughter ringing through the air. For a fleeting moment, Michael paused, watching them with longing. He was their age, yet their worlds were so different. They had time for games, for joy, luxuries he could not afford. His grip on the basket tightened, and he forced himself to look away. He had no time for childhood. His mother needed him. As the evening settled over the city, the streets began to empty, but Michael remained steadfast. He had to sell more, had to bring something home. The day had been long, the rejections many, but he wouldn't give up. In that moment, Houston's relentless rhythm continued around him, cars honked, streetlights flickered on, and people hurried past, eager to get home. But for one small boy standing on the corner with a basket of candy, home was not a place of comfort, but a responsibility. A duty. And he was willing to fight for it. The streets of Houston buzzed with the usual evening rush, commuters hurrying home, streetlights flickering to life, and the distant hum of music drifting from a nearby cafe. Among the chaos, Michael's small figure stood firm, his candy box strapped to his neck, his voice hoarse yet persistent. "Candy for $1, he called out, his words blending into the city's restless energy. Across the street, Jonathan Lockwood stepped out of a sleek glass building, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He loosened his tie, inhaling the thick summer air, his mind still tangled in the remnants of a long business meeting. His phone buzzed in his pocket, it was Brittany again. He ignored the call, sighing as he slipped the phone back into his jacket. His eyes drifted over the bustling sidewalk, landing on the small boy weaving through the crowd. Something about the way Michael carried himself, unyielding, yet fragile, made Jonathan pause. He watched as Michael approached a businessman, holding out a neatly wrapped candy bar. "Just $1, sir," the boy said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his face. The man didn't stop. He didn't even look down. He simply waved the boy off and disappeared into the sea of people. Jonathan found himself rooted in place, watching as Michael adjusted his basket and moved to the next person with unwavering determination. It wasn't the first time Jonathan had seen street kids in Houston, but something about this one struck him differently. It wasn't just the persistence, it was the desperation behind it. Without thinking, Jonathan crossed the street. "Hey, kid," he called. Michael turned quickly, his eyes wide, hopeful. "You want some candy?" he asked, holding up a slightly crumpled chocolate bar. "Just $1. Jonathan studied him for a moment. The boy's face was streaked with grime, his eyes too old for someone so young. His sneakers were worn, barely holding together. His clothes hung loosely on his small frame. "What are you doing out here this late?" Jonathan asked, his voice softer now. Michael hesitated, gripping the box tighter. "Selling candy." "For what?" Michael swallowed hard before answering. "For my mom. She's sick." Jonathan felt something shift inside him. He glanced at his watch, then back at Michael. "Where is she now?" "At the hospital," Michael admitted, his voice quieter now. Then, as if afraid Jonathan might walk away, he quickly added, "She really needs medicine." The rational part of Jonathan whispered that this wasn't his problem. He had places to be, a life carefully built over years of discipline and hard work. But another part, one that had been silent for far too long, urged him to stay. Jonathan pulled out his wallet. "I'll buy the candy," he said. "All of it." Michael's face lit up, his hands fumbling to shove candy bars into Jonathan's hands. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Jonathan handed him the bills, then paused. "Take me to the hospital," he said. Michael froze, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. "What?" "Your mom," Jonathan repeated. "Take me to her." For a moment, Michael hesitated, scanning Jonathan's face for any sign of deception. But something about the man's tone, calm, steady, made him nod. "Okay." As they walked through the dimly lit streets, Jonathan glanced down at the boy beside him, his small feet moving quickly to keep up. There was a quiet strength in Michael, a resilience that reminded Jonathan of someone he used to be. The hospital loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights stark against the darkness. Jonathan inhaled deeply, not knowing what he was about to walk into. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and cold sterility, a stark contrast to the humid Texas air outside. Jonathan followed Michael through the dimly lit corridors, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. The boy walked with quiet urgency, his small frame tense with worry. There, Michael pointed toward a corner where a frail woman lay in a worn hospital bed. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, her hands gripping the thin blanket as if bracing herself against an unseen force. Jonathan studied her carefully. She looked weak, exhausted, but something about her features seemed vaguely familiar. Michael rushed to her bedside, taking her trembling hand. "Mom, I got some money today. We can get your medicine now," he said, his voice filled with the kind of hope only a child could hold on to. Carolyn stirred at the sound of her son's voice, her eyes fluttering open. But when her gaze met Jonathan's, she froze. Her fingers gripped the blanket tighter, her breath hitching in her throat. Jonathan frowned. "Do I know you?" His voice was calm but firm, his sharp gaze locked onto hers. Carolyn swallowed hard, her mind racing. She hadn't expected to see him again, least of all like this. The memories surged forward with startling clarity. 6 years ago. A rainy night in Houston. A hotel lobby bathed in dim golden light. Carolyn had been working the late shift at the front desk when he walked in, his suit slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, his expression carrying the weight of something heavy. She had helped him to his room, given him water and aspirin, and listened as he spoke, his words slurred from exhaustion and whiskey. She hadn't planned on staying. But that night, two lonely souls had found comfort in each other. By morning, he was gone. She had never been able to find him again. She didn't even know his last name. Until now. "It's nothing," Carolyn finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must be mistaken." Jonathan studied her face, sensing something unspoken between them. He glanced at Michael, then back at her. "Mom, he's really nice," Michael chimed in. "He bought all my candy and wanted to help you." Jonathan's expression softened as he looked at the boy. He knelt beside the bed, lowering his voice. "What's wrong with her?" Michael hesitated. "She's just sick," he said simply. "The doctor said we need a lot of money to help her." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He looked at Carolyn again, noting the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she was struggling to hold herself together. Carolyn exhaled shakily. She couldn't keep this secret any longer. "Michael," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "Sweetheart, could you step outside for a moment? I need to talk to Mr. Jonathan." Michael tilted his head, confused, but nodded obediently. "Okay, Mom." He slipped out into the hallway, letting the heavy hospital door close behind him. Jonathan's gaze never left Carolyn. "What is it?" he asked, his voice cautious. She gripped the blanket tighter. "I need to tell you something," she said, her words trembling with emotion. Jonathan leaned in slightly. "About what?" Carolyn swallowed, then met his gaze with a quiet resolve. "Michael," she whispered. "He's your son." Silence filled the small hospital room, heavy and unrelenting. Jonathan's body tensed, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "What?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. Carolyn's lips trembled, but she held firm. "That night, 6 years ago, at the hotel," she said softly. "I didn't know how to find you. And when I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone." Jonathan's mind reeled, fragments of that night rushing back, the soft voice, the fleeting connection, the warmth of something he had dismissed as temporary. Michael. His son. His chest tightened as he looked toward the door where the little boy had just exited. I need to confirm this," he said, his voice faltering. Carolyn nodded, her eyes filled with something between relief and apprehension. "I understand. Do whatever you need to do." Jonathan stood abruptly, pacing the small room. The reality of what she had just revealed pressed down on him like a weight he wasn't prepared to carry. But no matter how overwhelming it felt, one truth remained. His life had just changed forever. Jonathan sat alone in the hospital waiting room, the weight of the DNA test results pressing down on him like a stone. The envelope in his hands felt heavier than it should. He had asked for this, had demanded proof before accepting what Carolyn had told him. But now, staring at the printed words inside, he felt his world tilt beneath him. Michael was his son. A lump formed in his throat as memories of the boy flashed through his mind, his determination, his resilience, the way his brown eyes held a quiet strength beyond his years. How had he not seen it before? The guilt crept in swiftly. 6 years. 6 years of this child growing up without a father, struggling alongside a mother who had carried the weight of their survival alone. Jonathan had spent those years buried in boardrooms, negotiating deals, expanding his wealth, never knowing that out there, in the streets of Houston, his own flesh and blood had been selling candy just to survive. His hands tightened around the paper. There was no undoing the past. But he could choose what came next. Taking a steadying breath, Jonathan stood and walked toward Carolyn's hospital room. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, his mind still reeling from the revelation. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Carolyn looked up from her bed, her face weary but expectant. She knew why he was here. "You've seen the results," she said softly. Jonathan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "He's mine." A flicker of relief crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by caution. "I told you because I had no choice," she admitted, her fingers gripping the thin blanket. "I'm not strong enough to take care of him the way he deserves anymore." She swallowed hard. "He needs someone. He needs you." Jonathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I should have been there," he murmured, his voice laced with regret. "For both of you." Carolyn shook her head. "You didn't know." "But I do now." He stepped closer, his voice steadier this time. "And I won't walk away." A tear slipped down Carolyn's cheek, but she didn't brush it away. She had spent years fighting, surviving, but now, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. Just then, the door creaked open, and Michael peeked inside. His innocent gaze flicked between them, sensing something had changed. "Can I come back now?" he asked hesitantly. Jonathan looked at Carolyn, and she gave a faint nod. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "Come here." Michael hurried to his mother's bedside, taking her hand with the kind of devotion only a child could have. Then he looked up at Jonathan, eyes bright with curiosity. "Did you get the papers, Mr. Jonathan?" Jonathan crouched beside him, his gaze gentle. "Yeah, buddy. I got them." Michael tilted his head. "Was it important?" Jonathan managed a small smile, ruffling the boy's messy hair. "Very important." He took a deep breath. "It means I'm not just here to help your mom. I'm here for you too." Michael blinked, processing the words slowly. Then, his face lit up. "So, you're gonna stick around?" Jonathan let out a soft chuckle, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't expected. "Yeah, kid," he said, his voice full of quiet certainty. "I'm not going anywhere." Michael turned to his mother, grinning. "Mom, did you hear that? Mr. Jonathan is staying." Carolyn nodded, her eyes glistening with something between relief and hope. "I heard, sweetheart." Jonathan glanced between them, a silent vow settling deep in his chest. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he knew exactly where he belonged. The hospital room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the faint hum of voices from the hallway. Carolyn lay back against her pillow, exhaustion evident in her frail frame, but there was something new in her expression, hope. Michael sat beside her, his small fingers wrapped around hers, his legs swinging idly. Across the room, Jonathan stood by the window, his arms crossed as he gazed out at the city lights. A week ago, he had been a man focused only on his wealth, his business, and a life devoid of deep personal ties. But now, in this sterile hospital room, he felt something shift, something bigger than boardroom deals or financial success. He turned toward them. "The doctors say you'll be able to go home soon," he told Carolyn. She nodded, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "Michael will be relieved," she said, squeezing her son's hand gently. "He's been worried." Michael looked up at Jonathan, his brown eyes full of unspoken questions. "Are you still going to help us, Mr. Jonathan?" Jonathan crouched beside the boy, his gaze steady. "I told you, kid, I'm not going anywhere." Michael's face lit up, his excitement barely contained. "Does that mean we're like a family now?" Jonathan glanced at Carolyn, their eyes meeting for a brief moment before he turned back to the boy. "It means I'm going to make sure you and your mom are okay," he said. "No more selling candy on the streets. No more worrying about how to pay for medicine. I'll take care of you both." Carolyn's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, but she saw the resolve in his expression. She had spent years fighting, surviving on her own. But now, for the first time, she wasn't alone. Jonathan stood, running a hand through his hair. "I know I have a lot to make up for," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I can't change the past, but I can be here now. If you'll let me." Carolyn studied him carefully. She had spent so long relying on no one but herself. Could she trust him? Michael, sensing her hesitation, looked up at his mother. "Mom, can we give him a chance?" he asked softly. A lump formed in Carolyn's throat. She had carried the weight of their struggles alone for so long, but here was her son, willing to trust, willing to hope. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Michael beamed, turning back to Jonathan. "You hear that? We're giving you a chance." Jonathan chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "I won't waste it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were wounds that couldn't be healed overnight, and trust that had to be built over time." But in that moment, something stronger than fear settled between them, a promise, a new beginning, and the start of a family that had been lost but was now found. For the first time in years, Jonathan Lockwood felt a sense of purpose beyond his business empire. Every evening, he visited Carolyn and Michael at the hospital, bringing books for Michael and sitting with Carolyn as she regained her strength. It wasn't perfect, there were still unspoken words, lingering doubts, but step by step, he was building something real. But not everyone welcomed this change. Across town, Brittany swirled the wine in her glass, her manicured fingers tightening around the stem as she replayed her last conversation with Jonathan. He had grown distant, distracted. She had tried to be patient, to remind him that they had been rekindling their relationship. But it was clear his focus had shifted. And she knew exactly why. Jonathan had always been a man of logic and control, yet now he was caught up in some emotional fantasy, playing the hero for a woman from his past and a child that should never have been his responsibility. She wouldn't allow it. The next morning, Brittany made a call. Dr. Stephen picked up on the second ring, his voice smooth but cautious. "Brittany. To what do I owe this call?" "I need a favor," she said, her tone sharp. "It's about Carolyn, Jonathan's little charity project." There was a pause. "Go on." "She's under your care at the hospital, right?" "I need her recovery to slow down." Dr. Stephen exhaled, his voice dropping lower. "You do realize what you're asking?" Brittany rolled her eyes. "It's nothing drastic. Just enough to buy me some time." "This isn't my first time handling unconventional requests," he said carefully. "But tampering with a patient's care is risky." "I'll make it worth your while," Brittany pressed. "And it's not like we're talking about life-threatening measures. Just enough to keep things in place until I sort things out." A long pause. Then, "Fine," Dr. Stephen said. "But it won't come cheap." Brittany smirked. "It never does." Over the next few days, Jonathan noticed subtle changes in Carolyn's condition. At first, he dismissed it as part of the healing process. Recoveries weren't always linear. But then, she grew weaker. Her coughing fits worsened. The color drained from her face, and the progress she had made seemed to vanish overnight. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. One evening, after checking on Michael, who had fallen asleep beside his mother, Jonathan cornered Dr. Stephen in the hallway. "Why isn't she getting better?" he asked, his tone sharp. Dr. Stephen adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable. "These things take time," he said smoothly. Jonathan didn't buy it. His gut told him something else was at play. That night, he stayed at the hospital longer than usual, watching over Carolyn, his mind racing. He had promised Michael he would protect them. Now, he had a feeling he was fighting a battle he didn't even realize had begun. Jonathan had built his fortune on sharp instincts and quick decisions. He could spot a bad deal before the ink dried, sense deception in a room full of polished smiles. And now, standing outside Carolyn's hospital room, he felt it again: something wasn't right. Her health should have been improving. Just days ago, she had been getting stronger, even smiling more. But now, her energy had vanished, her coughing had worsened, and the light in her eyes had dimmed. Jonathan wasn't the type to ignore his gut. That evening, after making sure Michael was asleep in the chair beside his mother, Jonathan quietly slipped out of the room. He walked down the sterile hospital corridor, his mind racing. He needed answers. Spotting a young nurse at the station, he approached her. "Can we talk for a moment?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The nurse hesitated, glancing around. "Dr. Stephen oversees her care, sir. You'd have to ask him." "I'm asking you," Jonathan interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "Something isn't right. I need to know if anything unusual has been done to her treatment." The nurse shifted uncomfortably. Then, after a long pause, she leaned in slightly. "Between us, some of her treatments seem off. I've worked with Dr. Stephen for years, and this doesn't feel right." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold fury through him. "Thank you," he said quietly before walking away. He now knew two things for certain: Carolyn wasn't getting worse on her own, and Dr. Stephen was behind it. The next evening, Jonathan cornered Dr. Stephen outside his office, his patience gone. "We need to talk," Jonathan said, his voice edged with steel. Dr. Stephen sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Lockwood, I understand you're concerned, but—" "Cut the act," Jonathan snapped. "I know something's been done to Carolyn's treatment. Either you tell me the truth, or I'll find out another way. And trust me, I have the resources to do it." A flicker of hesitation crossed the doctor's face. He wasn't dealing with an ordinary patient's family. He was dealing with Jonathan Lockwood, a man who built an empire by dismantling those who crossed him. After a long silence, Dr. Stephen exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "It was Brittany." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "She contacted me," the doctor admitted. "Insisted on some adjustments to slow Carolyn's recovery. She made it clear she'd handle any fallout." Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides. The betrayal wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. Brittany had been trying to buy time, trying to keep him from moving forward. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "You'll undo whatever you did," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Dr. Stephen swallowed. I can adjust her treatment back. But Brittany—" "I'll handle Brittany," Jonathan said, turning on his heel. His mind was already made up. This wasn't over. Jonathan Lockwood had spent years mastering control of his business, his reputation, his emotions. But as he drove through the darkened streets of Houston, his grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had never felt a rage quite like this. Brittany had tried to sabotage Carolyn's recovery. It wasn't enough that she had left him when he needed her most all those years ago. Now, she had gone even further, manipulating a doctor, playing games with someone's life, all because she couldn't stand losing control over him. He pulled up to her sleek high-rise apartment, stepping out of his car with calculated purpose. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to end this. Brittany was waiting, draped elegantly on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand, as if she had been expecting him. Her lips curved into a smirk. "Well, that didn't take long," she mused, swirling the wine in her glass. Jonathan didn't bother with pleasantries. He stepped closer, his voice dangerously calm. "What did you do, Brittany?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "You'll have to be more specific, darling." Jonathan exhaled sharply, his patience gone. "Carolyn. The hospital. Don't lie to me." For a brief second, something flickered in her expression: fear? Guilt? Then, just as quickly, she recovered, setting her glass down with exaggerated grace. "You're acting like I tried to kill the woman," she scoffed. "I just delayed things. Bought myself some time." She crossed her legs, her gaze unrepentant. "You've been so distracted, Jonathan. Running off to play hero for some woman and her kid." "I did what I had to." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You mean you paid off a doctor to sabotage her treatment? You risked her life just to keep me tied to you?" Brittany rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. She would have recovered eventually." "You're overreacting." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You have no idea what you've done." Brittany sighed, leaning back into the couch. "Jonathan, let's be honest. Do you really think this little rescue mission of yours is going to last? You're not a family man. You don't do emotional attachments. You'll get bored, and when you do, you'll come back to me." Jonathan stared at her, the words hitting him like a slap, but not in the way she intended. She was wrong. For the first time in years, he wasn't lost in the emptiness of his success. He wasn't filling the void with shallow relationships and meaningless deals. He had Michael. He had Carolyn. And they mattered more than anything Brittany could ever offer. His voice was like steel. "We're done, Brittany. Pack your things and get out of my life." Her smirk faltered. "You don't mean that." Jonathan didn't flinch. "I do." Silence stretched between them, thick and final. Brittany's eyes narrowed, but she saw the truth in his face. This time, she had lost. As Jonathan walked away, stepping into the night, a weight lifted from his shoulders. He had wasted enough time on the past. Now, it was time to build a future. Life has a way of bringing us unexpected second chances, even when we least expect them. Jonathan Lockwood spent years chasing wealth and success, believing that power and control were the only measures of a life well lived. But it took a small boy selling candy on the streets and a woman from his past to show him what truly mattered: family, love, and responsibility. For many of us, life moves quickly. We get caught up in our careers, our ambitions, and sometimes, we let meaningful connections slip away. But this story reminds us that it is never too late to make things right. No matter how much time has passed, no matter the mistakes we have made, we always have the opportunity to show up, to love, and to build something real. Jonathan's journey teaches us that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the relationships we nurture and the lives we touch. And as we grow older, we realize that the moments spent with loved ones, their laughter, their trust, their love, are the greatest treasures of all. It is never too late to choose love, to seek forgiveness, and to embrace the family we have, whether by blood or by choice.